Are we in a quorum?
That we are.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, for all of the Senate's vaunted traditions about grand debates, we rarely practice the actual art, the real back and forth, the exchange of ideas. For weeks now, we've heard our Republican colleagues come to the floor and rail against the Green New Deal, as the leader just did. Democrats have simply been trying to get a few honest answers out of the Republican leadership about their position on climate change so that we might have a real debate. So yesterday, as Republican after Republican lined up to give speeches against taking bold action on climate change, several Democrats tried to steer the conversation in a more positive direction by asking our Republican colleagues simple questions. And I ask this again of every Republican, and particularly of Leader McConnell. Do you, Leader McConnell, and our Republican friends believe climate change is real? Yes or no? Do you believe that climate change is caused by human activity? Yes or no? And most importantly, do you believe that Congress should do something about it? Yes or no? If our colleagues believe that it's a problem and agree to that, what's their plan to deal with climate change? We know they don't like the Green New Deal. They've made that clear. It doesn't forward the debate. But what is their plan? We might have ruffled some feathers on the other side. I think my colleagues just wanted to give speeches on the Green New Deal and then leave the floor. It's a sad state of affairs when even a little debate, even heated debate, is something unsettling here in the Senate. But I have to give credit to the few Republicans who did engage us. A few said they did believe in climate change and offered some examples of minor legislation where our parties could work together to begin tackling this crisis. I give them credit for that. But here's the problem. When is Leader McConnell going to schedule time for consideration of this and other climate change legislation? We Democrats are ready to work. Will Leader McConnell bring his own members' clean energy legislation to the floor? Others have said climate change is happening, but the free market could take care of it through, quote, innovation. With all due respect, that doesn't mean much. Most of us would agree we live in an incredible time of innovation and technology, and yet we continue to pour even more carbon into the atmosphere than previous years, not less. Left alone, the market has proved incapable of curing climate change for the simple reason of what economists call externalities. You run a coal plant. You make the profits from selling the electricity that the coal plant produces, but you don't pay the price for the carbon you put in the air. So it's not going to happen through the free market alone because of what even Adam Smith recognized. There are externalities that have to be captured, and that's government's job, to at least make sure they are captured. Another block of Republicans took a different tack. A few of our Republican colleagues said yesterday that climate change was real, but only because the climate has always been changing and all flora and fauna contribute to it. What are we to do, they say, as they throw up their hands and look to the sky? Ban volcanoes? Unbelievable. What an amazing canard that is. Those who said it, and there were a few right here yesterday, would get an F in middle school earth science with that kind of reasoning. We all know, at least we all ought to know, that human activity, particularly the burning of fossil fuels, has pushed the amount of carbon in our atmosphere to record levels, trapping more heat than ever before, and changing the climate in ways not seen before in our history. Maybe denying or misleading about climate change is considered acceptable in the modern Republican Party, where it's come to be expected. And we wonder why that is so. Some argue it's because the people don't believe in science. Some argue because they just are stuck in the status quo. And some argue it's because there's a lot of oil money cascading into the Republican Party. When you read about all these multi-millionaire and billionaire new oil magnates who send tons of money there, some argue that. Can't prove which one's true, but we do know it leads to terrible, terrible inaction. So, I'd like to see my colleagues who don't admit the severity of climate change go talk to the farmers in Iowa dealing with drought, the fishermen in Alaska and North Carolina, the homeowners in Florida and the Mountain West. See if denying recent climate change works there. It sure doesn't work on the south coast of Long Island, where we had Sandy, which made believers out of many who were skeptical in the past. Nonetheless, Madam President, we made some progress yesterday. At the very least, my friends on the other side know they'll not be able to execute their standard playbook. Democrats are not going to sit around while Republicans come to the floor and yell about socialism as they have for the past 2 decades. We're going to make Republicans answer core questions about real change. That's what America wants. One of the reasons all this scare tactics didn't work in 2018 and the House is now Democratic, and we kept most of our seats, even in very red states, I suspect many of my more reasonable colleagues would prefer that, a real debate, than gotcha politics that Leader McConnell is so adept at playing and is playing once again with this cynical Green New Deal ploy. Now on another matter, voting rights. Today marks the 54th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, the protest march in Selma, Alabama, that led ultimately to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. It was one of the most noble acts in American history and will be remembered centuries from now. The courage of those who marched across that bridge, including our colleague John Lewis. It's a reminder that one thread of the American story is about how, despite our founding democratic principles, there has been a long march to achieving the franchise. We had great democratic principles at the beginning. It was brand new. It was great. But remember, in 1789, in almost every state, the only people who could vote were white, male, Protestant property owners, leaving out probably, I imagine, even a majority in this chamber would be able to vote. And so we have to keep improving that democracy. No one says we should only have white, male, Protestant property owners vote today because it was true in 1789. We have to move forward. We have to make voting more available and easier, because the right to vote without barriers is what our soldiers for the centuries have died for, and what the people on that bridge marched for. Well, the march is still not over. In the wake of disaster, that was the Shelby decision, Supreme Court's decision, 19 states rushed to pass discriminatory voter restrictions. In North Carolina, the Republican state legislature drew up laws that, quote, targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. How despicable. How despicable. The Republican legislature did that. And that's not my words, that's the court's, after looking at the evidence. 50 million Americans are now not registered to vote. And even though we don't talk about it enough, we have a population larger than 2 states living here in Washington, D.C., without full congressional representation. We Democrats are ready to work. Again, Leader McConnell gets up and he talks all this negativity, exaggeration, hyping, scaring, just like Donald Trump. Well, why doesn't Leader McConnell put some legislation on the floor? Now, today, on Bloody Sunday, I want to mention 3 things we could do right now to bolster voting rights. 1, undo the damage of the Shelby County decision by restoring the formula for preclearance. 2, automatic voter registration. 3, D.C. statehood. Anyone who's been observing the floor of the Senate will have noticed by now just how vociferously our Republican leader opposes H.R. 1, which, among other things, would make Election Day a federal holiday and attempt to get big money out of politics. Leader McConnell has gone to call these ideas a power grab, labeling the bill the Democratic Politician Protection Act. Leader McConnell, we are proud that we want more people to vote. Why are you ashamed of it? Why do you run away from it? Leader McConnell, we are proud that we want to get the influence of big special interest money out of politics. Why do you say that's partisan? It's the wrong thing to do, and 90% of all Americans, Democrat and Republican, don't like to see big money cascading into politics. Argue the merits, leader. When you think doing those things are democratic things, we're proud. And the Republican Party should be ashamed that they're not for them and have to call them names. To say that allowing more Americans to vote, getting big money out of politics is bad for Republicans and good for Democrats, That says a lot right there. It's a dark day for the Republican Party if their leader in the Senate has to argue against more Americans voting because it would hurt their party at the polls. Maybe we should go back to the old days and have fewer people vote. 1789, only white male Protestant property owners. Come on. This idea that having more people vote is a democratic power grab when it's part of the fundamental root of our democracy, it's an act of desperation by the Republican leader. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Republican leader is pledged to bring up his version of the Green New Deal for a vote, but not H.R. 1. He's happy to twist words against it himself, but he knows voting rights are a hard thing to argue about. And if he wants to try to bring it up on the floor, we welcome it. Welcome a discussion. So make no mistake, Democrats are going to fight to make the ballot access easier, challenge all attempts to disenfranchise American citizens, and get the influence of big special interest money out of politics. Finally, on China, news reports continue to suggest that President Trump is close to cementing an agreement with Beijing that, unfortunately for America, for American workers, would fall far short of expectations. Earlier this week, the New York Times reported that China is drafting new laws on foreign investment to pacify the United States. But those new laws do not include any changes to how China forces American business to transfer technology and know-how as the cost of doing business. Our best companies, if they were allowed to sell in China unfettered, they'd have huge amounts of profit and they'd employ huge more amounts of people here in America. China doesn't let that happen while they can sell freely here. The president was right to target China. The president was right to impose tariffs on China. The president will have taken defeat out of the jaws of an almost victory if he now backs off for the sake of a photo op or some brief changes in what China purchases and forsakes American wealth, American workers, which China is stealing our wealth, unemploying our workers every single day. If President Trump accepts a short-term purchase of American goods in exchange for a reduction in our tariffs without structural reform to China's predatory trade practices, shame on him. If he thinks that photo op will help him, it won't. If he thinks temporary little bump in China buying more soybeans or more steel products will help, it won't. He will lose. Because one of the best things that he's done, something I've praised him for, and many other Democrats and many other Americans have, will be gone. I've given the president credit publicly when he's taken on China. Americans, as I said, have lost millions, trillions of dollars of wealth, millions of jobs to Chinese IP theft. The president's been right to challenge China on those issues, and his tariffs have brought China to the negotiating table. But now that China's at the table, President Trump must not walk away without achieving what he set out to achieve. In short, to cut an unacceptable deal, a weak deal, a photo op deal, at this stage would be to squander a historic moment to put American businesses, workers, and inventors on a level playing field at long last. And it would be viewed as a capitulation by the president on one of his signature issues. It would be the inverse of what he did on North Korea. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.